Hey, welcome everybody. I am so happy that you joined me here this evening. I know Thursday night, 7 p.m. Thank you all for giving me a little bit of your evening. I am very lucky today. I have with me someone who thinks very differently about cities in a city that when we talk about what he's going to talk about, you're going to say, this guy can't be in New York City. But he is. He's with me. He is in New York City. The man who runs Market Urbanism Report. I hope I said that right. Scott Beyer. How are you, sir?
I'm good. How are you, Larry?
I'm doing great. I'm so happy that you joined me here today. And for those of you more interested in what he's about to say, you can head over to his website, marketurbanismreport.com. Now, you talk about the idea of classical liberalism, the idea of a free market in New York City. And New York City, is, basically a communist state, right? City state, right? It basically is a communist city state. You must get pushback all the time from this.
Yes, and I think that I do agree with you. It's a status city, as many big cities are in the country. And I think to just talk about my general premise, not just for New York City, but for every city in the U.S. and really around the world, is I'm advocating for something called market urbanism.
Okay.
Market urbanism, the definition of that is the cross between free market policy and urban issues. It is a classical liberal philosophy. That's where it's rooted from, Chicago School economics.
Sure.
Things like that. And I would really say that there's two definitions of market urbanism that I'm always advancing. One of them, which does not so much relate to New York City, is the idea that, and it's more theoretical, it's the idea that cities should have private governance. Which
cities should have private governments. Okay.
Yes.
That you're speaking like you're speaking Russian to a New York City guy. So go ahead, tell me, please.
Well, I mean, there's already experimentations with this sort of thing happening around the world.
Mm-hmm.
They're sometimes called charter cities or special economic zones.
Yep.
And it's the idea that you have a more privatized model for urban governance. So things that a public government might normally do, you could outsource to private companies, and you could even have like a board of investors run as opposed to an elected council. And
but isn't the fear, particularly in a city like New York, with our history, isn't a fear immediately that if you create some form of privatization or board, is that, those elite bankers and developers are going to run everything and crush the poor people? Isn't that the fear that someone immediately thinks about?
Well, yeah, that's why I'm saying also, though, that it's very... This theoretical model of market urbanism is something that I call abstract.
Okay.
It's theoretical in the sense that it doesn't really get tried anywhere around the world. I mean, some people do it on a small case-by-case basis,
sure.
But that's kind of like the radical theoretical version of market urbanism.
Okay, so I guess what you're saying is that's like the place that we could start moving towards.
Yeah,
and see how that works.
I would almost say, not we moving towards as so much as it could be tried.
Okay.
It could at least be experimented with. And
is
so,
this something that should be started in like a small city, like a Harrisburg with like 50 or 60,000 people in it? Or is this something that should be started in a relatively large city, like a Philadelphia or a Phoenix?
Neither, to be honest. I'd say it would sooner be something that you would go to Texas, and Texas has very loose laws about incorporating new cities.
Okay.
They're generally pretty hands-off on what kind of provisions and land use regulations that a city has to have. And so you could kind of have this blank slate that you could start a new city with in Texas. And it's even more like that in the developed world, where I know somebody is experimenting, a group of investors is experimenting with a private city in Honduras. And that would be completely separated from the national government and just be able to run on its own. So again, though, kind of a radical idea.
Yeah.
I think the other version of market urbanism that I generally talk about more, and that I think will be more conducive to the show, is the idea of not full-on libertarianism or anarcho-capitalism, but something that's kind of pushing in that direction.
Okay.
That's going into an existing city and embracing existing political realities and kind of pushing in the direction of libertarianism and offering a market-based set of ideas for existing problems relating to housing and transportation and various public admin.
I like where you're going with that. I always want to move closer towards freedom whenever I can, realizing that, we live in a very tough spot. A lot of people, they're afraid of it. They don't want to do it. They're scared. So I want to go to something which I think is controversial.
Mm-hmm.
But it's what you're talking about. You think that it's a good idea to have pay restrooms. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. And we actually used to have pay restrooms in the United States, and they still do exist around the world. I didn't actually get even interested in the concept until I visited Mexico and realized that you can pay a small fee to use a private restroom. Basically, like, people who run stores will open up their restrooms to paying customers. And so there wasn't this consistent problem that you find in other cities in the US, where if you have to go to the bathroom, you can't really find a place to go unless you go into Starbucks and pay like $5 for an orange juice.
Right.
But yeah, so basically we used to have for pay restrooms, and they got illegalized because activists thought that they were they do something that a lot of activists do, where they talk about how there's a fundamental right to certain things, like there's a fundamental right to use the restroom. Therefore, it should not be for profit. You shouldn't have to pay to do it. And what happens in the real world is that then creates scarcity, because when you take away the profit incentive to operate something, then the entire business model goes away.
So, but obviously the retort you're going to get is, see, Scott, you just hate homeless poor people, right? Because then they won't be able to go to the bathroom. Why are you a mean guy? So I'm sure you have an answer for this. But I mean, clearly someone's going to say, wait a minute, if we have paid toilets, what about the people who are poor? What about the people who are homeless? What about that?
Well, I'd say they're already in a position where they're not able to use clean restrooms, because the profit motive has been taken away and this business model has been made illegal. The private sector doesn't provide it. And then the government, I think this is probably just as crucial as a point, is the early activists thought that the government should then come in and provide the restrooms.
Because what could go wrong with government? What could go wrong?
Yeah, the government doesn't provide restrooms effectively. And one real world example I could mention is the public loos that San Francisco tried to provide, that were basically just kind of like these street loos. You see them in San Francisco and Los Angeles, but it's provided extremely expensively. There was a lot of potential corruption going on between the contractor and the city government. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, it wasn't, they're not safe. Like they ended up getting occupied by drug addicts. And so people who actually had to use the restroom could not safely use them. Right. So that's an example of where basic public choice problems of a government trying to run a service, there's no profit incentive in place. And so there's no incentive to provide the restrooms or provide them effectively. So the interesting thing is, if we did have a for-profit model, I could see in places that have a lot of homeless people, such as Skid Row in Los Angeles or the Tenderloin in San Francisco, I could see private companies providing porta-johns on those streets and maybe charging 25 cents. And I think homeless people could come up with 25 cents, and so they would be able to use a clean restroom provided by a private company, where now they're literally having to go on the street.
No, that's an interesting point, because I do think, that, and I don't mean it to be cruel at all. I mean, homeless people can come up with 25 cents. Mm-hmm. I think you're right. I've seen them do it many times, right? They're able to eat. They're able, and some homeless people are actually working poor. So if you actually are working poor and you're homeless, well, then clearly you have enough. You can do 25 cents to go to a bathroom, and I get it. It just it tastes bad to someone who thinks, well, don't you want to help the homeless person? But I get your point. I think it's a valid point. Scott, can I take a couple of comments? There's a lot of people commenting. You okay with me taking a couple of comments?
Sure.
Sean says, Mr. Beyer does great work. I love that. There we go. I love
Thank you, Sean.
Yes. Liberty Shamrocker, I don't know who that is, but she says, great topic, good evening. So she likes what you're talking about. I love that. So good. Craig says, privatization, market urbanism, school of economics, capitalist propaganda.
This sounds like Twitter.
Yes, I love that. Perfect. Jimmy says, am I hearing decentralization? Is that part of what you're saying, decentralizing?
It is. Yeah, I love the word decentralization. And I know that you could probably relate to this as well, where I view a lot of the political struggles in this current era as not being so much Republican versus Democrat. It's being centralization versus decentralization, authoritarianism versus libertarianism.
Absolutely.
The big versus the small, things like that.
I'm a big proponent of setting up a system with a freer market that takes the big guys down without government. I'm a big fan of that. I'm with you. I'm totally with you on that. My concern, I guess, is New York City, because I live here and I'm born here. It seems like a different beast, right? I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like I don't have data to back this. This is just my emotion, right? I feel like New York City is a different beast because it's so big, because it's so dense. I feel like that a lot of these things would have to be different. Like you bring up the idea of tolling, tolls being like a good thing. Like tolls can be good. But my image of tolling in New York City is, $18 to cross a bridge, right? Mm-hmm. That's my image of tolling. So I feel like tolling affects the poor and middle class because the wealthy already live in Manhattan, so they don't get hit by the tolls. Am I wrong with this? Is New York City a different animal, or could this work anyplace?
Well, I think
I asked like 4 different questions. I'm sorry.
The issue you bring up with tolls about it being regressive, I think that applies anywhere. And so that could be, you could structure the payment system in a way that the people who really cannot afford to drive and pay the tolls might get a discounted rate or get some sort of rebate at the end of the year. But I think in general, the people who are driving are generally higher income than the people who are taking transit. And that's the case in New York City as well. I mean, you think about like people coming in from New Jersey, that's in a lot of cases, that's the suburban business class who are working in Midtown and Wall Street. And so I think they can foot the higher toll. Now, I look at tolls as being a replacement for specific types of taxes or fees.
Oh, okay. So you're saying remove the taxes and add the tolls, is what you're saying, not just add tolls.
Yeah, I would view tolls as a better way to fund roads than, say, gas taxes.
Okay.
So that would be, so I'm not necessarily coming from it from a statist position of let's get more revenue for the government and make the government bigger. It's more along a philosophical line of let's make services pay for themselves. Okay. And so that would be one use of a toll. I think another use of the toll, and I don't know if this is something you would agree with or not, but I view cars are somewhat of an externality, particularly in a place like New York. Mm-hmm. They create a lot of air pollution. They create noise.
Yep.
I think at this point there's more traffic related deaths than there are gun murders in New York City.
I don't know. Recently we had a bad year, so that may not be true. But yes, actually, I think bicycles are a problem now because of cars and bicycles having to share the road. I think bicycles are a really big issue in New York City right now, right? The extra bike lanes we put in, bikes getting hit. I think that's really has been our issue right now is bikes and cars and pedestrians. And it seems to me whichever one you are, you hate the other two. So if you're a pedestrian, you hate all these cyclists and drivers. If you're a driver, you hate all these cyclists and pedestrians, right? You hate whatever you aren't.
And don't forget mopeds. Like I know that rebel mopeds have kind of been back and forth politically in the city, and electric bikes, which go a little bit faster than a normal bike. Yep. So I mean, I think a lot of the questions that a market urbanist is looking at is they're saying, there's only a set amount of right of way in a place like New York City.
Sure,
it's very valuable space. and there's a lot of people competing for it and who want to use it.
Right.
And so you got to balance on some hand, there's environmental goals. Like I think more people riding bikes is going to be better for the environment than more people in cars.
Sure.
But at the end of the day, I think the pricing of the right of way is what gives you market feedback to determine how the right of way should be used, if that makes any sense.
So what you're saying is if we do things like congestion pricing and things like that, then people, if they really want to go into the city, they'll pay the price to go to downtown. And if they don't, then they won't pay the price.
Right.
But doesn't that again become regressive, right? I'm sure someone who can't afford it probably, I assume, still probably wants to go downtown and see cool stuff in Manhattan. Right. Doesn't the rich person say, I'll pay the $45 for the cab ride? And the poor person goes, or the middle class person goes, do I really want to drop $45 for a cab ride? Is that, am I wrong on this?
Well, so I think one of the keys of congestion pricing is making it dynamic. So in certain parts of the day, usually morning and evening rush hour, it's going to be very expensive. Other parts of the day, it's cheaper. So I think that dynamic pricing spreads out the demand across the day. If you don't really need to make a trip during rush hour, you'll make a trip at an alternative time. So I think it takes away congestion. And then I think another thing that it does is it encourages ride pooling, because if 5 people are splitting the cost of road use by getting together into, say, an Uber or a Lyft, that's more efficient and ultimately will lead to a faster way to get around than everybody being in their own car. So I look at it as I guess the short-term benefit of it is that it relieves congestion, but I think a long-term kind of big picture thing that road pricing does is it's going to help the private mass transport industry scale, because it's going to change the financial incentives of road use. And so I look at a service like Uber, which now mostly just carries around 1 or 2 passengers, as potentially scaling up into a bus service, which it's doing in some cities around the world.
Yeah. Wow. All right. Let me grab a couple more comments. I got people commenting. You got people excited, so that's good, I guess. So Tom says, I remember when I used to be oppressed with payphones. I like that, Tom. I remember too. I still remember. If you're like under 30, under 20, you may not know what the phrase drop a dime means.
I have no idea. That's a basketball phrase.
Drop a dime is you would drop a dime in the payphone to call somebody and tell on somebody. That's where drop a dime. Tom and I are old enough. We remember it used to be a dime in a payphone to call somebody. So that's where that thing drop a dime. You put a dime in a payphone and you call and snitch on somebody. And that's where you drop a dime on somebody used to be. Yes, I know. Tom and I are old. It's fine. But yes, that's what I remember payphones too. I absolutely do. Yes. So John says, I paid 15 pesos to use a restroom outside of Tulum, Mexico. It definitely made the top 3 worst restrooms I encountered in my 50 years on the planet. So I guess the question about that, I mean, it's a good point, right? Does it make for a better, worse, or the same restrooms? We're going back to restrooms now. If we do the paid restroom, as you said, in say San Francisco or whatever, how do you make it worth it to where it's worth to have an attendant there or whatever is the way you clean the toilet? I don't know. Is there like a spray down thing? Whatever you do, right? How do we make it worth it?
Okay, that reply person did have a valid point. So I just got back from Monterey, where the pay restrooms don't have toilet seats and don't have paper and are absolutely disgusting in some cases. But I think it's kind of a weird comparison, because you have to look at the economics of Mexico versus the economics of the US. Like, okay, I think it's poorer. And so whether or not the restrooms are for pay or are for free, they might just not be as well kept and supplied as well as a for pay American restroom would be. Now, so I mean, the research that I did said that for pay restrooms in the US used to be quite nice and were really well kept. And the ones in Mexico, they're substandard by US standards in the way that a lot of things are substandard in Mexico compared to the US, because it's a poorer country. Like the housing is less is less up to code and things like that. So,
okay. Missy says, coming from someone who has actually been homeless, there were times when I couldn't even find a dime. All right, so maybe I'm wrong here. Maybe there's times when you couldn't. Could you find a situation to where you could have a series of, or a larger bathroom that is sponsored by someone, and then they get their name on it, and then that could be free, or could you have a pass that someone, I don't know, is that something that is there any example of free privatized, does that make any sense? Free privatized bathrooms. Is there such a thing?
Well, you could have a voucher system distributed by the government. So you put a bunch of porta-johns in a homeless encampment, and the government or maybe a philanthropist distributes a voucher, and they're able to use the restroom. But I mean, I think we need to stress again, though, that the current status quo is worse than anything that I've suggested. I mean, where the homeless literally have to use the streets in many cases. And that does happen in some of the worst neighborhoods in San Francisco and
New York City too.
New York City too.
Yes, absolutely.
So I mean, that's the status quo we're trying to disrupt.
No, I love what you're saying. I say all the time when people attack my plans, I say, please don't compare my plan to perfection, because I lose every time, and so does every other plan. Instead, compare my plan to status quo. Is it worse than status quo? Then I lose. Is it better than status quo? Well, then I'm winning, aren't I? So I'm with you. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it was the great, and I'm by great I mean great, Thomas Sowell, the economist,
sure,
who said that pretty much every policy, he said the phrase "compared to what" has to be the predominant question that you ask about every policy, because otherwise the skeptics can kind of create the straw man where they're saying, well, it's not perfect, so therefore it's not good. And it leads to a lot of bad situations in policy. I mean, another example I could say would be when I went to Monterrey, Mexico, by the way, there were not many homeless people. That, compared to San Francisco, New York, there were not many. There was not a visible homeless problem. Okay. Well, a lot of the reason for that is that they have favela neighborhoods that are generally not very well serviced by the government, are not up to code by any stretch. I actually unwittingly walked through a couple, and they feel like third world encampments.
Sure,
but it's at least a minimum standard that people can live in that will prevent them from being homeless. And in the US, we can't build that kind of settlement because there's so much regulation. And so it would be a classic case where something that's clearly not perfect is still better than the absolute worst outcome that there could be.
Well, I guess my concern here is you've also discussed the idea of zoning, right? Since we're kind of in that world now with building things and zoning, that mixed zoning isn't great. Zoning in general isn't great. You're not a fan of zoning at all. You're not really a fan of zoning. That, I'm sure there's so many people, they're scared. Oh my God, you're going to put a pig farm next to me and they're going to be slaughtering pigs next to me. Or you're going to put a factory next to me and they're going to be making, whatever, a big stack of smoke, pouring into my backyard, right? Isn't everyone afraid of that? Isn't that why so many people want zoning?
Well, again, that's kind of the most extreme, like that's a caricature argument where you're taking the most extreme possible scenario and saying, this is how it's going to be everywhere. But I would say particularly in a place like New York City. So let's examine what would happen in a place like New York City if it suddenly didn't have zoning. What I don't think would happen is I don't think you would get a bunch of industrial smokestacks opening up in the city. And the reason is that the land values there are very high.
Sure.
And there are certain uses that accompany high land values. And guess what? A pig pen is not one of them. A smokestack is not one of them. Those types of industries have an advantage in locating further out, where land is cheaper and more horizontal and everything. And so I think in 2021, market forces would do a very appropriate separation of a lot of uses in cities that zoning actually does not do very well right now. Like in New York City, a lot of the industry, a lot of the kind of the incompatible mix between industry and residential that exists, say, in places like Brooklyn, is because of zoning.
Yeah.
It's because of zoning.
Queens too. Queens too. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like this legacy industrial zoning that says we need to have blue collar jobs here.
Right.
And so I think if we were to have a market-based system, I think what you'd get is just a lot of high density housing. I think even office is kind of a shaky sector at this point. And
yes.
And so is retail. And so I think you want the absolute quickest way for New York City to address this affordable housing shortage, just in zoning, because
wow, that's so radical to New Yorkers. We're all about it, and we're all NIMBY, right? We're all not in my backyard. We use zoning to stop people from doing stuff, and we go and fight in the board, and then we wind up, we landmark our stuff so that no one can build anything on it. You're you're being like the anti-New York City guy. I love it. Don't get me wrong. I'm not against what you're saying, but you're like a New York City heretic saying that, right? It's crazy.
Well, I hope that the skeptics who are watching this though can see the logic of what I'm saying, which is that if you look at the different sectors of real estate, office is on the decline, retail is on the decline with the rise of Amazon. Industry is not necessarily on the decline, but would probably not be built in New York City for the reasons I explained earlier. However, there is a huge housing shortage in the city. So, I mean, basic market economics and price signals should tell us that if you loosen the zoning and if you just let the market work, the developers would be building housing. That is what is going to be in their bottom line. And so I would see a very quick reduction in home prices and a long-term end to the housing shortage.
Okay. Let me grab a couple more comments. Rebecca's a fan. She says, Scott is the man. So I guess you're the man. I like that. Good. Roy brings up a point. He says, but New York City residents benefit from great roads, even specifically if they don't use them. So is that a valid, piece that, okay, we're not using the roads, but we should have great roads anyway, or no?
Well, I'd be curious, by use them, does he mean drive on them? Because I don't know how anyone could possibly not use the roads. Like, pedestrians use the roads as well.
Okay.
So that's kind of what I'm getting at, because I think there's many people who want to use the roads. And I actually wrote an article talking about the 10 different things that people would use New York City curb space for. And it's not just, some of it is like the vendors. Selling hot dogs.
Yep.
And so a market-based system, I think, would transfer road space away from the dominance that the automobile now has over it. Because, you go down the Avenue of Americas and it's like a vast majority of that road space is being taken up by the automobile.
Yep.
The pedestrians are crunched together on the sidewalk trying to navigate around the bike share, like the dockless bike share and everything, the food carts and the vendors. And so it's like, let's have a conversation using market-based pricing on what people are willing to pay to use what amount of space. And I think you'd see a much more diversity.
See, but you brought up the word diversity that I think people are afraid of it. And I get it, because John brings this up. John says there are some barrier islands here in Florida that have some $15 to $20 tolls to keep undesirables off the island beaches. And I think we have a legacy of that in America. So isn't there an emotional thing that says, ooh, Scott, it feels like then we're gonna have segregation. We're gonna have the rich people here and the poor people there, and no one's gonna talk. Isn't there an emotional barrier to this that we just, from our legacy, we go, this just doesn't taste good?
Yeah. Okay. So two things that I think one thing that would need to happen in order for road pricing to be put into effect is liberalized housing policy.
Okay. So this isn't by itself. We've got a bunch of things we got to do.
Yeah. Northern Virginia would be a perfect example of an area that it kind of did both things wrong, in the sense that DC is very restrictive.
Sure.
So you can't afford to live in DC at this point unless you're either rich or live in a rent controlled apartment. And at the same time, they're pricing their roads quite high in some cases. So yeah, you're hurting the poor in that case, because you're not giving them an option like they still have to drive
Yes.
because of the restrictive zoning, and now you're sticking this regressive fee on them. So yeah, I understand that point absolutely, and that's kind of why a larger market urbanism vision says deregulate transportation and deregulate housing at the same time, and let market forces work for both.
Well, it's funny you bring that up because many of the reasons why people have to drive so far is because they can't live next to where they work.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah, right.
Exactly.
If you can live close to where you work, you don't have to drive. I completely agree. It makes total sense. So Andrew says, cities developed after invention of automobiles are structured differently than ones before. Same for infrastructure and centrally planned governments who pay for maintenance. Maybe need a redesign. And I want to bring this up because I think a good example of this in the world is Japan.
Mm-hmm.
I lived in Japan for 4 years.
Hmm.
And what most people don't know is there's a northern island of Japan called Hokkaido. That was the last island that was really developed by the Japanese. The cities in Hokkaido are way different than the cities on the mainland. The mainland, I mean, there have been Japanese cities for literally like 2,000 years. There have been Japanese cities for a very long time, far before there were cars, right? They had the emperor in like, the year 700. So they've had cities for a very long time. So it's a big difference. Is it time for a redesign? Or is it time for us? And I'll do the terrible thing, the terrible example. Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Europe was bombed like there was no tomorrow. So you get to rebuild because you're bombed, right? Terrible reason to rebuild, but there's an advantage. You can build a better city. Is it time for us to be redesigning? And the reason why I said is, you know how New York works. New York doesn't like redesign. New York just slowly morphs, right? Like that. Where do you go on that, Scott?
Well, so one thing that I think is really interesting to point out there, and the bigger way to understand transportation in this country is that it is government controlled. It is socialized. There was a time when it was not like that, but everything from the street grid that is laid out in modern cities to the interstate system was generally designed by the government. And so what I think and it's still regulated by the government and funded by the government today.
Yes.
And what I think that prevents fiscal discipline, in the sense that if you're a private city and you want to do something that has cost advantage, you might create a road that's 25 foot wide. But in a planned city that is propped up by government subsidy, that is often indirect and coming from higher levels of government,
sure.
You might,
and the money all has strings attached that says you must do X or Y.
And the money all has strings attached that come with specific codes that have to be followed, and in engineering standards. Everything is wider and more engineered than it would be in a free market. And there's all kinds of like individual examples that you just see everywhere, from Twitter to various blogs, showing roads the way they used to be designed when private entrepreneurs were designing them, because there was, of course, a trade-off. Like you don't want to consume, if you're a private entrepreneur who is dealing with certain land costs and economic factors.
Sure.
You don't want to make a road wider than it has to be, because that takes up space for potential building, for potential real estate. And so on the other hand, when it's socialized and the costs are disconnected from each other, why not make it wide? Because that's what the people want.
Sure.
Under some phony theory. So yeah, to put a more precise point on it, roads are wider and more over-engineered because they are run by the government.
There we go. Look at that. Craig says, you hate whatever you aren't. Change that and we make the world a better place. I'm with you, Craig. Yes, absolutely. So Liberty says, drop a dime turned into, here's a quarter, call someone who cares. That's true, because it went from a dime to a quarter. I remember. Yes, that's right. It was drop a dime on somebody, and then it became, here's a quarter, call someone who cares. Now, if you said that to someone, they'd say, why'd you give me a quarter? I got a cell phone. Why'd you give me a quarter? And if you're like under 20, they go, call? What's that? So they wouldn't even know what it is.
Yeah.
So, that's good. Mitchell says, I used a paid restroom and took a shower in a train station in Italy. It was lovely and clean.
Yes.
This kind of goes to what you were talking about, Scott, that it depends upon the country.
Yeah, Europe Europe still has pay restrooms, and they are quite to a high standard and very well maintained.
There we go. Steve says, I don't know if I like the idea of having to have a government voucher to use a public restroom. They'll tie it in with the Excelsior pass. Yeah, you got to have the COVID vaccine or something, right? And people like me will have nowhere to go. Well, I think that's a valid point. Right? If you do the voucher, doesn't that come with government strings attached too, right? You got to do X or you got to do Y or you got to submit this or submit that. Isn't that going to be an issue?
Well, I mean, the voucher wasn't a specific policy recommendation on my part. It was just answering a specific, question, which is, what if the homeless still cannot afford to use the restroom? Well, you could have a voucher system. I mean, that's something you could do. I would happen to think that the homeless could probably find a way to pay for the market rate of a restroom if the provider is only providing porta-johns. Like that's just kind of a low standard thing you could stick onto the street, and I don't think it would cost very much.
So if we go with a kind of a bottom up growth model in a city, don't you run into the fear and maybe the reality that if it's bottom up and growing without heavy government control, you get the slums of Mexico City or the massive sprawl of, I don't know, Houston or something, right? I mean, you get something like that, don't you? Or maybe you get the problems you have in New Orleans where, people are like just ready to be destroyed by the next wave that comes by or something like that. Isn't that a concern?
Well, it's interesting. So you mentioned 3 different kinds of urban models. So I would have to address each one.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just talking trash. I apologize. Pick the one that makes the most sense for you, Scott. I'm sorry, but that was the fear that comes, right? If government doesn't control it, then there'll be some crazy stuff like one of these 3 cities.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so going one by one, I think the favelas that you find in Latin America are not a fundamentally bad thing. If you don't want to go to them, you don't have to. But I mean, people live there, and it has benefited them. And I think that if the modern homeless that occupy many of our cities were able to build some sort of encampment or tent city without the government coming in and doing sweeps, and there's even like philanthropists who provide land nowadays for them to be able to do that, or they could do it under the underpass. I think that would be a market outcome for the extremely low income, and I think it would be better than what they're able to. Obviously, living in a tent on the street. There's often safety standards that can be established in these types of communities. So it's kind of like somebody is saying that's what the market will do, and I'm saying, well, that's actually that's a better alternative than what we have now.
Okay.
So now do Houston sprawl.
Yeah. Do you think Houston is better off or would be worse off without it?
Oh, I think the sprawl for Houston has actually been good.
Okay.
It has stabilized the home prices there. Houston has some of the fastest growth in the U.S. And yet, I know
it's our 4th biggest city now.
It is, and actually, yeah, it's a huge metro. I mean, almost a global mega city at this point, and yet it has median home prices below the national median because it builds so much.
So this is literally what you're saying. So you're saying don't do New York City and do rent control. Instead, do Houston and let people build, and you'll solve your housing problem by just letting people build.
Yeah. Build in the city, build in the suburbs, build in the exurbs. I mean, wherever people want to settle. I mean, the only qualifier I might add to this is that, kind of going back to the socialized road system that we were talking about earlier, I think to some degree, people in Houston are incentivized to live in sprawl rather than living in the center city because the roads are built for free, quote unquote, and they're used for free, quote unquote. And so it's a system of incentives that kind of stretches the development pattern out further and leads to certain environmental waste. But
so you're saying if the roads in the case of Houston were more expensive to use, that people would create more businesses locally in their neighborhoods and wouldn't have to go to the city center?
Well, no, what I'm saying is that I think the settlement pattern, which generally we were talking earlier about the sprawling settlement pattern. Yep. I don't know that we would have this much sprawl if it weren't incentivized so much.
Oh, you're saying people might actually move into the city center instead, and you get more high rises and such.
Yeah, and Houston is getting a lot of that. I mean, it's not just sprawl. Mm-hmm. Like Houston is getting a lot of new skyscrapers and multifamily in the urban core, and I'm saying effectively that the market would probably produce more of that if we didn't have this system of incentives that makes it really cheap to have to build horizontal infrastructure that people then use for free.
Got it. Okay, so let me grab a couple more comments if I could. Liberty says she's trying to follow my 80-20 rule. My 80-20 rule means, if you don't know, it means if you agree with someone 80% of the time, they're an ally, even if you disagree 20%. She likes your roads. She's not happy with your bathrooms. She's not buying it, Scott. Sorry. She's buying the roads. She's not buying the bathrooms. But I get it.
The good news is it's not going to happen anytime soon anyway. So
there we go. See? You're going to win anyway. I love it. Matthew says, I agree. I'm running for city council on abolishing zoning. Wow. You got a guy who was right with you.
That's music to my ears.
Yeah. You might want to go over to, if I click right to the marketurbanismreport.com. And you might want to read some of the stuff about that there. So I'm just saying, maybe if you're running for office, you might want to just make that click over there, read a couple things, maybe send an email. I'm sure they'd be more than happy to chat with you about the zoning issues. I'm sure they'd be more than happy to. Am I right?
Yes.
There we go. More than happy to. So you might want to go do that. Andrew says, my hometown has so many zoning laws that it's hard to start a business and to have a business even in the town. I offered to have the business owners decide what zoning laws that want to make it easier to have in a business in the town. It didn't happen. Wow. So yes, so now the zoning laws here in this case, what he's saying, Scott, is it's stopping not just people from living, but from starting businesses.
Yeah, I mean that's the other thing we cover. I mean, we mostly talked about how zoning, is an impediment to new housing, but it's also very much of an anti-business regulation, and there's kind of some overlap between occupational licensing and zoning working together to prevent startup entrepreneurship. But I mean, like in a lot of cases, I remember studying Detroit one time in their zoning code, and how like they had all these great entrepreneurs like Barry Gordy who started out of their basement or out of their garage.
Sure.
And like created incredible businesses. And now in Detroit, home-based businesses are illegal, although I'm sure many people still do it.
But I'm sure they do. Because prohibition always works. Yeah. Go ahead. Yes.
But still, it's kind of crazy. It's like, I mean, if you're an entrepreneur, you can't afford necessarily office space. And so a home-based business ban, which usually comes about through zoning, is it's just another example of how zoning is regressive and hurts people.
Winds up hurting the poor. I agree. Karen says the homeless in Ithaca, New York is increasing at an incredible rate. The unfortunate thing about being homeless is they can't get benefits or assistance because they don't have an address. Department of Social Services won't allow them to use a P.O. box because they live in tents, what is known as the jungle. They need help regardless of maintaining an address. I think it's exactly right. If there were tiny homes or small areas, you could create addresses and they could get the help. I think you're right. This is kind of what you're saying, Scott, right? I mean, at least if you're in an area like that, the mail can get to you, right? Because they know where you are and you can have an address that has a number on the street or something.
Oh, yeah. I mean, when people talk about, I mentioned earlier that the homeless should be able to form encampments. And I know that word probably sounds, to a skeptic, sounds bad, but it's not as bad as it sounds. I mean, there's a lot of kind of private governance models that come with homelessness. Or homeless encampments. Sometimes they're like HOAs where they have actual rules that are enforceable, and they have some sort of governing structure that ensures things like safety and security, and maybe even shared utilities. So it's not literally just put a bunch of tents under an underpass.
Right.
It's more sophisticated than that when it's allowed to be. And yeah, I think it would have the effect of helping people normalize their lives, have a mailing address, have a safe place to sleep, so on and so forth.
Let's deal with some of the things that have happened recently, and how you think maybe a more market, if we were more market driven even before or even during the pandemic, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it hit New York City hard, right? It hit us hard. We're packed in together. The pandemic hit us hard compared to other, places. Does it matter if it's, market urbanism or no? Is it better, worse, the same?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this, so science and pandemic and public health policy isn't necessarily a huge focus of market urbanism.
Mm-hmm.
I will say it seems like the lockdowns are they're excessive, though. I'll just say that.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like there could be a more market-based way, and just allowing people to make their own decisions about health and follow their own, health and financial self-interest. I think erring in that direction over having, unilateral shutdowns from one man is a much better model.
So you're saying if it was more localized, I guess, or more, more privatized in that regard, that individual units within a city could decide, hey, we need to lock down, or we shouldn't lock down, or whatever the case may be, that would be more effective or more efficient?
Yeah, I mean, well, we kind of had that with the 50 states. The 50 states all had their different, policies that they did, and
sure,
Florida was much more open. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's like the proof is in the pudding, in the sense that a bunch of people are moving from New York to Florida, which tells me that they're kind of like their revealed preferences show that they want less of a lockdown than New York is now imposing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah, more localism. And I also think just like maybe more an appeal to basic constitutional rights as far as freedom.
Where in New York that Constitution suggestions. It's not right. Suggestions. I'm teasing. Everybody, don't get mad at me. I'm gonna get tons of hate mail. I'm just teasing. I'm joking. So yes, but I want to take a second to give a quick commercial, guys. We're talking about the pandemic, so do me a favor. Head on over to that link right there. That link, it's up in the show description. That is the advocates.org pandemic survey. They are a sponsor of mine, and they would like you, please. It's free. Head on over there. Take that survey. Talk about, see what you think about lockdowns, mask mandates, all the things that happened during the pandemic. What do you think about it? What's your opinion? Fill out that survey and share the survey and let people know you've taken it. And it will also show you what other people think also. It's free. They're my sponsor. Makes them happy, makes you happy. Support the show. Give me 5 minutes. Take that test and share it. Finish the test and share it. Theadvocates.org, the pandemic survey. Please take that today. It helps me tremendously. Also, if you've taken it already, like, comment, and share this. Let people know this is happening. If you like what we're doing here, you see me doing it, let people know. How else we're going to grow? How else we're going to make people like me and Scott famous? If you don't go out there and comment and share, it's not going to work that way. And of course, if you think that you can help me out and you've got some spare, enough money that you can get one of those pay bathrooms, throw some money my way. Patreon.com/Sharpe Way. $10 a month helps me build my team out so I can keep doing this more and more and more. Thank you, Scott, for letting me do a commercial. I appreciate it.
I hope it doesn't cost $10 to use a restroom.
It doesn't, but I'm just making that up because I want $10. That's all. I want $10, so I'm just making it up. So
there used to be a service in New York City that unfortunately shut down, but it was called Louis, and it was an app where people could, like, say if you're a restaurant that has a restroom, you could sign on to the Louis app and offer your restroom to the general public. Wow. And they pay like the general public pays, say, like a $25 a month subscription, and they can use this network of restrooms around the city.
Oh, that's kind of cool.
What happened to it? I guess it couldn't get enough customers. I don't know.
There we go. Yeah. Okay. So Jimmy says, speaking of Houston, how do you think this would play out with their power grid? Would this have any effect on the power grid? We maybe ask you questions that are outside of your world. We hit you with a pandemic. Now we're hitting you with the power grid. Do you have a feeling how this would play out?
I
Would there be
really
any
don't
difference?
I really don't have an opinion. No, I mean, I haven't studied the Houston power grid enough or the Texas power grid. From what I understand, it's very complicated and it's very
Yeah.
regulated, and I would imagine that has a lot to do with the recent events. But otherwise, not an expert.
There we go. Steve brings up a very valid point. He says, some of the ideas I'm hearing here are good. All for building anything, anywhere. It boggles the mind how we can build self-storage all over, but not small dorms for the homeless. That is such a valid point. I see self-storage everywhere, but I don't see dorms for the homeless. I mean, right?
It's a great point because it just shows how everything is so arbitrary, and we've learned to live with it. And I don't think most people, even like a lot of constitutional conservatives and libertarians, don't necessarily stop to think, how absurd is it that when you build a building, the ground level has to be office or retail, and the floors above have to be housing?
I don't know.
If you want to talk about like the epitome of central planning, I mean, this is like going into a restaurant and saying 10% of your entrees have to be pizza and 90% of what you sell has to be pasta. It's just like, it's so fundamentally absurd.
And what I see it in Queens, where I live in Astoria, is almost always you can see one side of the street will be all stores on the bottom and then apartments on top. And the other side of the street is all single family or two family homes, not apartments, homes. And you go down one more block and they swap it. One side is all apartments, the other side is homes. And the apartment side has no trees, but the home side has trees. So you can walk down the street and see exactly what people were building. It's crazy. My neighborhood is exactly like that. Just what you're saying is what my neighborhood is. It's like someone planned the whole thing.
Yeah. It's nuts.
Yes.
It's nuts.
So Tim says, home-based business bans hurt the poor and minorities. They force us to do business with the big guys, in quotes. Be a mechanic or a plumber, it discourages on-the-job training. It hurts kids who might want to earn a few bucks. It's actually even worse than I'm trying to make it sound. Yeah, it is pretty bad, Tim. It is actually worse. So, I mean, you have to have a moral or ethical argument here, don't you, Scott? I mean, you do, right?
Yeah, and I mean, so I'm originally from Virginia, and when I'm in Virginia and need an auto repair, there's kind of a network of people who probably illegally do auto repair out of their home workshop or garage. They're way cheaper than going to a brick and mortar auto repair. I mean, cheaper in the order of magnitude, like half as much to do the same thing as a brick and mortar. And we all know this is true. We know why it's true, because they have less fixed costs than the brick and mortar does. And so, the more bottom-up entrepreneurship, the more competition, the more they undercut each other's prices, the better it is for the consumer. So it's not even helping. It's not only just helping the entrepreneur, but this bottom-up deregulation is also helping the consumer and creating competition in the marketplace.
Absolutely. Well, look, guys, again, if you want more on Scott, please head over to marketurbanismreport.com. See what he's doing. Check him out. If you're running for office, some people are running for office, reach out to them. Get some cool policy tips. Do that. I'm sure they're going to help you out with that. So, Scott, anything you want to talk about before we wrap this up? Some piece you want to talk about or bring up, or some topic I missed?
I think we covered a lot. I mean, the only thing I would add is, along with going to my blog, there's a great Facebook group, Market Urbanism Report Facebook group, 10,000 members strong, rabid conversation every single day. It's very politically diverse. And
the link, by the way, is in the description. I put the link to that group in the description. So, guys, if you want it, click that link, head right over there.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Can I ask you one final question?
Sure.
In New York City, what's the first step? Is there a first step, or is it just too big that you can't do a first step? You got to do a whole big thing. I mean, I'm just curious. It's a monster. Is there a first step, or do I have to do like 8 things at once?
It's going to be a mind-blowing suggestion, but I would love to see the MTA experiment with privatization, particularly the subways. In Hong Kong, they had a once public company or incorporation that ran their subways, and get this, it went public because it's profitable. It's an IPO.
Wow, look at
Imagine
that.
Profitable rail. And the way they're profitable is they also own a lot of land around the stations, and they build it as densely as possible. And it's a great example of how not only does it provide great service, but again, it's profitable. So it's not a net cost to taxpayers. We got to do something different with the MTA. The MTA is like the anti-Hong Kong.
Yes,
it is. It's a state-run bureaucracy that is about as inefficient as it could possibly be, underutilizes its land holdings, and they got to look abroad to see best practices.
There we go. You heard it. That's the first thing. Scott let us know. MTA, first thing, New York City. That's the answer. Scott, so thank you so much for coming on and giving me some of your evening. I appreciate that. Everybody else, thank you so much for showing up and commenting and going back and forth. Again, please check him out, marketurbanization report.com. Scott, thank you so much for coming. Everyone else, I will see you all very soon.